Roger, we're in your lounge room again, and I'm looking at the chart you've prepared on Shakespeare's 154 sonnets. Can you give us a recap and the significance of the sonnets and the chart having them on the wall?
When I first read the sonnets, the whole set of sonnets, 154 sonnets from Morgan in 1995, I realised that embedded in the sonnets was just this amazing philosophy, and it's taken me quite a while to write out and to explain what I was seeing. And in the process we have published about 8 books, so everything that we're talking about is available either from those books or online. We've discussed those books in previous interviews. But for this chart, I prepared it for talks that I gave at universities, and the idea was to lay out the whole 154 sonnets from as they are in the facsimile from 1609, because it's only through looking at the facsimile exactly as it was presented by Shakespeare in 1609 that all the elements of the philosophy become evident. So for instance, last time we discussed that nature is the overarching entity in the sonnets, called the sovereign mistress, and has a numbering of 1, that the female also has a numbering of 1 with her 28 sonnets, or the lunar number, and that the male sonnets, the sonnets to the master mistress, there are 126 of those, which adds up to 9, so the male is 1 short of the unity, and so he needs to recover his unity in his relationship to the mistress, and also for his understanding.
Roger, in our previous interview, when I was asking you questions about this chart, you were explaining some of the internal structure of the chart. Can you go back into it, and let's start with increase.
So in the previous talk, we not only considered the overall structuring of the sonnets in terms of nature and the female and the male, we also began to look at the increase argument and its relationship to the increase in poetry sonnets, and then on to truth and beauty and truth. The idea this time, before we talk about the philosophical significance of Shakespeare's sonnets, which we hope to do the next session, we're going to look at some of the evidence in the sonnets themselves that show that Shakespeare was very intentional when he published his set of 1600 sonnets in 1609 to present the philosophy behind all his work. It's as if in the 1590s, when he was writing sonnets for plays like Love's Labour's Lost, and other sonnets that he was writing, that by 1600 he made some sort of decision or other to reorganize or organize the sonnets to present his philosophy. And so there's a number of sonnets that have quite a romantic element to them, but there's a number of other sonnets that have a really philosophical or intentional quality to them that a lot of the commentators find difficult to relate to. So my mission in a way is to show that when he was organizing the sonnets up till 1609 and then published them in 1609, there's huge numbers of bits and pieces of the sonnets that indicate that he had every intention to present his philosophy in the sonnets. So for instance, if we look at the increase sonnets, or where he presents the increase argument, we notice in the first line of the first sonnet the word increase is mentioned. And so the increase is the theme throughout the first 14 sonnets, all the way to the end of sonnet 14, where the words truth and beauty are mentioned for the first time. Throughout that sequence, the word beauty is mentioned, but not the word truth. Truth only comes in at the end. So what we're dealing with is more of a biological function, a sensory function. And so there's no requirement or no need for Shakespeare to mention poetry or verse. He just talks about the way in which we need to respond to each other and react to each other. So what we find, for instance, that when you get to sonnet 9, which finishes at the bottom of the page, that sonnet mentions love, but the sort of love it talks about is self-love. And so the young man who he's addressing in these sonnets, he's accusing of being too involved in his own thoughts, his ideas, typical male or masculine type thinking. So he addresses the sonnet. So by the time he gets to sonnet 10, for the first time in the sequence, sonnet 10, he mentions love for another, and he not only does that, he mentions himself for the first time. So he mentions himself as I, me, or my. And that is totally different from every other sequence of sonnets that was written in his day. Every other sonneteer is addressing his beloved as I love you, or something like that from the first sonnet onwards. So this set of sonnets doesn't mention I, me, or my as the poet until Sonnet 10. And then in Sonnet 11, it's really critical about the consequences of the youth's self-love. And that if he doesn't mend his ways, then it will be the doom of the human species. Now, he actually doesn't say that this young man needs to increase himself, but he says that if everyone was like this young man, if everyone in effect was like the Pope, for instance, then in 60 years in Shakespeare's time, or whatever length of time you want to think, that would be the end of the species. So that's the argument. The argument isn't that everyone needs to increase, whether you're gender specific or whatever you are, but to continue as a species, we need to increase. And that has a huge effect on our ability to understand and to express ourselves. And so when you move on to the increase in poetry sonnets, what we find is that for the first time in the sequence, the idea of writing, he talks about engrafting, both engrafting as a biological process, but engrafting the youth in his verse. And so sonnet 16, 15 and 16 are a combined set of sonnets, and so they talk about increase until you get sonnet 17, which mentions beauty first and then truth. So beauty is talked about in terms of seeing and truth in terms of saying. And then you have the famous sonnet 18, but sonnet 18 is no more than just one of the increase to poetry sonnets that talks about the need for the young man to combine or to unite with others to create something for himself. And then sonnet 19 completes that sequence.
Roger, when I look at the chart, I see that the female or mistress sequence is organised according to beauty and truth, but the male sequence is truth and beauty. Please explain.
Well, we've already looked at the increase sonnets, and we've noticed that they go from the idea of increase. So the final two lines of the increase sonnets in sonnet 14 mention truth and beauty. But when you go to sonnet 17, it mentions beauty first and then truth. And so there's a bit of a question then about exactly what those terms might mean and why I seem to think that they are really significant for understanding the philosophy. Something we didn't quite mention last time was that not only does the poet talk about himself as the I, the me and the my in sonnet 10, the word poet is mentioned for the first time in sonnet 17. So the word poet is introduced into the sequence. And so gradually Shakespeare as the poet, or the poet representing Shakespeare, is bringing to bear upon this set of sonnets, not just the biological function of increase, but what it means to perceive things, to understand things, and possibly to express things, which is, he uses the words beauty and truth and beauty for. Now, that's a bit complex, but in his set, we can see that if we go to the female sequence, or the mistress sequence, that only the word beauty is used from sonnet 127 through to 137, halfway through sonnet 137. And in every instance, the word beauty refers to incoming sensations. In fact, one sonnet talks pretty much about 5 types of incoming sensations: hearing, sight, sound, taste, etc. So it's very specific, talking about incoming sensations, as if somehow the mistress is the basic unit in human evolution and human understanding, represents or characterizes what sensations mean for us. And then it goes on to talk about truth. And so what you find in the first of the mistress sequence to truth, the word truth is mentioned twice in sonnet 138. And the discussion is about what it means to possibly understand somebody, whether they might lie or whether they might tell the truth, and how to work out what it is, and what sort of sensory possibilities you might use to determine that. And then it goes all the way through to sonnet 152. And here's Shakespeare organising his set of sonnets. In sonnet 152, the word truth is mentioned twice again. And not only that, the word forswear, oaths and vows are also mentioned in sonnet 152. So the idea of saying something, of determining something through the process of language, is really critical for understanding what Shakespeare means by truth. So we've got quite a separation then between incoming sensations as beauty and this idea of turning those sensations into in-language possibilities, which is what he means by truth. And in that process, we determine things by saying this is the case or this is not the case. And Shakespeare uses the word saying quite frequently throughout the set. If we turn to the male sequence or the master and mistress sequence, all of a sudden we seem to be dealing not with just beauty and then truth, but truth and beauty together. And the idea is that the poet has learnt from the mistress what the relationship between beauty and truth is. What he needs to talk to the young man about, or to the male, is how to untangle his sense of language from his internal sensations, his senses of love, his sense of the divine, and his emotions, for instance, or his intuitions. And that's where anyone who is of the disposition of that male or the master mistress goes wrong, and Shakespeare's trying to address it. So he addresses 126 sonnets to the male to try and get him to understand, like he has come to understand, what it means to understand something in terms of senses and language, and then how better to be able to use the internal sensations of the mind to express ourselves. So what you find throughout the set, that the words truth and beauty are mentioned frequently. In Sonnet 100, for instance, truth and beauty is both mentioned. There's a frequent mention of beauty separately and then truth. Sonnet 66, for instance, is a unique sonnet with a whole lot of ideas which end up with a conclusion, all based around the idea of truth. And so there's a very determined set of propositions and possibilities within Shakespeare's works that indicate that this basic pattern is critical to understanding his philosophy.
Roger, this is fascinating, the way you're explaining the chart and Shakespeare's sonnets, but there are other categories on the chart.
Well, we have covered things like increase and truth and beauty and truth, and nature and the female and the male. But as Brian, as you say, there are other categories, and so we could consider next time where time features in the sonnets, what role music has in the sonnets in terms of the structuring, what role the poet has in the numbering of the poet in the sonnets. Not only that, we can also demonstrate that the increase argument is structured intentionally into the sonnets. And we haven't even begun to consider some of the minor details, like, for instance, what is the significance of Sonnet 126 and its 12 lines and couplets, and how that relates to the dedication. So we look forward to next time, to the next interview, to look a bit more closely at some of the more details before we then move on to explain the philosophy that Shakespeare embeds in the sonnets.